Hello and welcome back to another video. This is the Programming Duck channel. My name is Spiros, and today we're going to look at a functional programming challenge that's intermediate, maybe advanced in difficulty. So this was actually an interview question that I was asked many years ago, and I found it quite interesting. So I thought, let's make a video about it. Now, there will be solutions at the end, and of course you have a chance to try and solve them on your own first. But just note that since this is a functional programming challenge, the solutions will be functions, but you can do it with classes and methods if you like, it can still work. And as a final note before we begin, this is somewhat of an advanced challenge, so if you're not familiar with functional programming, it might be a bit more difficult for you. In that case, you might want to brush up on that first with some beginner functional programming resources. So let's get started. So part one is here. You have to design a function or method that you can keep calling in a chain in the following way, as long as you keep passing in arguments. Okay. So for example, you can call it like this, as you can see on the screen, foo with argument 1, then with argument 2. And as long as you're doing that, as long as you're calling it with arguments, the function shouldn't do anything except collect the arguments and store them somewhere. Because when you finally call the function without an argument, right, with empty parentheses, at that point, it should console.log all the arguments you've passed in so far, okay? And that's the challenge. And for more clarification on that, you can see the code on the screen of how it's supposed to work. So let's go through it a little bit just to clarify. So you can see on the first line of the code, we're calling the function foo. You can give it a better name, of course, but in this case, we're calling the function foo with the argument, a string with a letter A. And nothing happens. The function just collects and stores the argument. On the line below that, we call it with A, and then we call it with B. And as before, nothing happens. The function just stores those arguments. Now, on the line below that, we call foo without an argument. When we call the function without an argument, that's when we want to console log with everything we've collected so far. Now, in this case, we haven't collected anything so far. So we just call console.log, empty, without any arguments. On the line below that, we call foo with A, and then we call it without an argument. So the overall result is we call console.log with A, and so on and so forth. Now, towards the bottom of the code, you can see an optional section. If you feel inclined, you can make the function accept more than one argument at once, right? So for example, we call foo. In the same call, we call it both with A and B, and that's the same as calling it with two separate calls, A and B. Okay? So that's the first part of the challenge. Now, part two of the challenge is a little bit more difficult. What you have to do is make a function that works similarly to how part one worked, but in this case, you have to make it stateless. And what that means is something like what the code shows on the screen. So in this version, the state of one function call can't be mixed up with the state of another function call, where depending on your implementation for part one, the code on the screen right here may not be working. Okay, so if you look at the code, we call foo with A on the first line, and we store that in a variable named A. Okay, second line, we call A, right? We got the result of calling foo with A, and we call that further with B, and we store it in a variable named AB, and then same thing on the third line. We get AB, call it with C, and we store that. Now, when we call A with empty parentheses, it should console.log A. All right, and when we call ABC, it should console.log ABC. Right? But the reason why this is part two of the challenge is because with a particular implementation of part one, this is not what might happen. When we call A, it might log ABC. If A is sharing the state that AB and ABC are sharing, then it will log out A, B, C. Okay, so that's the clarification. You need to make them stateless. You need to make them not share the state between those different function calls. And finally, part 3 shouldn't be very difficult if you've managed to do the other 2 parts so far. And that is to not hard code the function console.log. Instead, your first call to the function that you create must accept the function to call at the end. For example, the code on the screen, right? On line 1, we have our function. In this case, it's called act when called without arguments. We give it console.log. And then the rest is like part 2, right? Except that we don't have to pass in console.log. We can pass in whatever we want. And whatever we pass in is what's going to be called at the end. All right, so those are the challenges. And now if you want, feel free to pause the video and have a good go. All right, the next thing we're going to do before giving the solutions is we'll just give some hints for part 1 of the challenge. So if you're stuck, have a look here. So the first hint is the following. These challenges, at least when I did the challenge, it sounds to me a lot like carrying from functional programming, where, I won't go into too much detail because this isn't a functional programming tutorial, but with carrying, you do a similar thing to what you need to do in this challenge, right? You call a function with a single argument at a time, and then eventually it calls the actual function with all of the arguments collected so far. And in addition to that, you can make a function, a little utility, that takes any function and makes it a carried function. So you can do that. So you can take a function that normally takes 3 arguments all at once. You can use the utility on it, and then it converts the function into something where you can call it 1 argument at a time. So it's pretty similar. So I coded the implementation so I can look at it. So it helps me with the challenge, So if you want, you can have a go at implementing your own carry function. Or if you're not interested, here is an implementation on screen now. Okay, so hint 2 is just a quick one, something I've discovered while doing a lot of functional programming. And that is that in functional programming, if you're stuck on how to do something, a lot of the time it's very helpful to just add another function. More often than not, that means another nested function, right? So you have your higher order function, and then it has a function in there that it returns, and then maybe it has another function in that second one that it returns, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to be too specific, but if you're not sure how to solve these challenges, try something like that, right? Try having a single function, try having an inner function inside that single function, maybe even try having another level or something. Just a hint, I'll leave that with you. All right, and hint 3, and this one is more spoiler heavy regarding the solution for part 1, so be warned of that. You may want to skip this one if you don't want a spoiler one, but it's the following. One way to store the arguments that you receive in the part 1 challenge, here it comes, is to have an array. All right, so this is your final chance. We're going to look at the solution for part 1 now. So this is your final chance to stop the video and have a go if that's what you want to do. Otherwise, here we go. So here on screen, you can hopefully see the solution for part 1 now. Now, I'm not going to explain the ins and outs of how it works because this isn't a functional programming tutorial, but essentially we have something that's similar to the carry utility we saw in hint 1, I think it was, but we're storing the arguments in an array, okay? And, the execute function is where the majority of the work happens, right? We check, have we called the function with an argument, right? And if we have, then we store the results. And if we haven't, then we call the function. All right, so next, here is a hint for part 2 of the challenge, okay? And again, if you don't want hints, pause the video, try it yourself. But the hint is that compared to part 1, right, here the different function calls can't share the state. So you can't just use an array that's accessible by every execute function of different calls, you can't do that. Instead, you're probably going to have to use some sort of closure, right? So don't store your arguments in the array that's shared, do something to store them in a closure that's only accessible by the specific execute function for that function called. All right, and finally, here is the solution to part 2. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. And this is fairly similar to both part 1 and the carry utility. The main difference to the part 1 solution is that instead of having an array to store our arguments, we now have another inner function, right? The function gather args. And the logic is a little bit complicated, but if we look back in execute, what we're essentially doing, if we've called it with an argument, we return the result of gather args. And in gather args, we pass in all the arguments we have so far, right? So the args thing is the previous arguments we had before this specific call of execute. And the more args are the arguments we just got in this specific call of execute. So basically gather args, that function, is where we store the arguments, not in an array, okay? I hope that kind of makes sense. Again, I won't go through the code line by line, but yeah, that's the solution. And finally, we have the solution for part 3. So here it is. Hopefully you can see the code on the screen. And it's fairly simple. In fact, to me, it actually looks simpler than the solution to part 2, right? Because we know we're going to have a first argument. So we don't need to run our execute function right away to see if we've had the first argument or not. We always will, so we don't need to go through the process of calling gather args and then execute and then returning that. So in my opinion, it makes it a little bit easier. So here's a solution. All we do is just the first time we call the function, we capture the function, right? That's pretty much it. And then the code inside the function is pretty much the same. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the video. And that was the challenge. I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know if you came up with any other solutions to what we had in this video. Please feel free to leave a comment below. Let us know if you had a go at it, if you completed it, if you found it easy or difficult, and if there are any other challenges like this that you would like us to cover or that you just found interesting. Anyway, that's it for the video. So if you like this video, please click the like button. It really helps. And if you want to see more videos like this, then please subscribe. All right, thanks very much and see you next time.